Good afternoon. Welcome to UCSF Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, chair of the department, and we have a special session today as people sign on. This will be a fireside chat with Dr. Eric Topol. I'll be brief on Eric's bio. If I wasn't, it would take the entire hour. So Eric is the founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute, a world-renowned cardiologist and geneticist. He is focused on using genomic and digital data to make healthcare better and individualize and democratize healthcare. He's published over 1,300 peer-review articles as a member of the National Academy and is one of the 10 most cited researchers in medicine. He's authored 3 terrific best-selling books on the future of medicine. He founded the new medical school at the Cleveland Clinic. He's the editor-in-chief of Medscape, publishes the absolutely essential Substack newsletter called Ground Truths, and has been a go-to person on social media since COVID, with about 700,000 followers, and has done an immense public service by basically providing an annotated, very thoughtfully annotated, up-to-the-minute literature review on everything in COVID. Probably most importantly, he was a resident in medicine at UCSF, as many of the leaders I know in COVID were, including Ashish Jha and Rob Califf and others. And I have to say, Eric, and if you could come on, that would be great. When I tell folks who are of that vintage that I'm talking to you, they always tell me Eric Topol stories, and this is now 45 years later. So why don't we start? We're going to spend most of our time on COVID, a little bit of time on digital transformation and AI, but tell us what you were like as a resident. Love to hear this.
Well, Bob, it's great to be back with you at UCSF Grand Rounds, and thanks for revitalizing Grand Rounds. They've really been terrific. I've watched a number of them and glad to participate again. When I was there from 79 to 82, it was a fantastic experience, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it really set off my career on good footing, but I got to see everything between the 3 centers, and the ability to have not just from faculty and attendings, but from your residents to work with them is just a phenomenal experience.
And you've had really one of the most extraordinary careers I can think of in academic medicine. When young folks come to you for advice, like, is there any pearls that you've had over the years in terms of telling, let's say, a resident or a medical student about how to think about their career?
Well, as far as the training part, being at a place that you see it all, or as close as you can get to that, and have the people there that are, really supportive, make it fun. That's, I think, really ideal. I think there are a lot of training programs that are not as much fun and not as much exposure to seeing as much as you possibly can in medicine. So that's kind of the general guidance that I would provide.
Great. Let's start with COVID. So maybe we'll start with very open-ended. Tell us how you describe the current moment.
Well, it's about as good as it's been for a long time. We got through this XBB.1.5, this kind of unique recombinant with 2 significant mutations on top of that. We got through in this country pretty darn well. Withstanding that was a big deal because it was predicted from its functionality to be quite transmissible and potentially quite a bit of immune escape. So it looks as though our immunity wall, that is both the vaccinations, the boosters, the infections, and all their combinations, is holding up well. Now, this is 15 months or so, 16 months into Omicron, and that is a good thing because we haven't seen anything past Omicron. So unless we see something else, we might be in a true endemic state. It's much better to diagnose that when you go backwards and say, oh, wow, it's been relatively quiet with little wavelets, nothing major, no major surge. There's really only 2 variants that are kind of taken over the world. And, it's another cousin of XBB.1.5, 119. So, things look good. The real question, Bob, is, are we going to see that family, unexpected, like Omicron, that is a pi or sigma, whatever you want to call it, where the virus finds yet another major new path to get even more transmissible, more immune evasive, potentially even more virulent. That's what is out there dangling. Hope
Mhm.
all of us, of course, hope we never see that,
Right.
but there's no guarantee.
And again, this is hard, no guarantee and hard to know where things go. But is your sense that COVID, as people think about behaviors, as policymakers think about policies, is your sense that we're now living in the world COVID-wise that we're going to be living in 2 years from now?
That might be the case. If we don't have another family of variants, this is kind of what we're stuck with for the foreseeable future. And that's why I still think we really need more tools to work with, like nasal vaccines, so you feel more confident about not getting infected, pan-coronavirus vaccines, and just in case that bad news family of new SARS-CoV-2 comes upon us. But yeah, and of course, what happens if Paxlovid starts to show any signs of resistance, which fortunately it hasn't?
Mhm.
We're out of monoclonal antibodies. None of those work. We've left our immunocompromised in a very compromised position. So, especially for the people of advanced age, it's not an ideal thing because the virus will continue to circulate.
Yep.
And, if you let your guard down completely, you could wind up getting COVID and then there's that unpredictable aspect of long COVID that we can't ignore.
Yeah. Oh, I'm in a hotel room, so actually in San Diego at a meeting. Um, you have you've talked about this need for more and better research on vaccines and nasal vaccines and pan-coronavirus. Where do you think we are on the pathway to them, both in terms of the scientific enterprise, but also the policy and funding landscape?
Well, we're really in a bad shape for the funding and priority. I'm hoping that we're going to hear more about that in the weeks ahead. That somehow the U.S. found some money to put towards it, but
Yeah.
we haven't heard it yet. Now, with respect to the science, it's exciting. It's just as exciting as the original mRNA and other vaccines that came upon us so quickly. The idea is that we've already seen one nasal vaccine in India by Bharat Biotech, which is a U.S. Washington University, Michael Diamond intellectual property. And we have many others, Florian Kramer and Akiko Osaki. So many people in the U.S., leading scientists, have come up with very attractive nasal vaccine candidates, but they're not being pursued in this country. Or if they are, they're in slow-mo.
Mhm.
And the silly thing here is that we keep thinking this is like flu, and FluMist doesn't work that well. But we already know that we can triumph over this virus so much better. I mean, look at Paxlovid versus Tamiflu, or look at our vaccines compared to flu vaccines. So I'm very confident that nasal vaccines will work. We already seen one, actually, a new data from a second one looks quite good. And there are many more in the hopper. The point is that, as you're getting to, Bob, we haven't given it the priority of resources to succeed quickly. And, it's a shame if we have to import these from other countries when it was actually our inventions. And I think nasal sprays are very alluring because if you even had to take a spray every 3 or 4 months, it doesn't have the systemic reactogenic effects. And it could really pronounce a reduction of infections, which is what I think we just don't want to promote. And we've never, since Omicron came along, we've never had a good way to, in a durable way, to have a marked reduction of infection propensity.
And would the science say that it is possible to have a nasal vaccine that would, I've always wondered, is it just you give it a spritz and it lasts a week or two, and so then what's the use case when to use it? But do you think that the science would say that we might be able to find one that lasts for 3 months?
Yeah, I think 3 or 4 months is probably likely. It's possibly longer. But once you have it, then you have got a platform to try to get better durability. And
Yeah.
that's the other thing regarding the shots. Who wants to get a shot every year or every 6 months, which is probably more than what the data tells us. I know when I've had five, and every time I get the shot, I get so darn sick for a couple of days. I don't really want to go through that on a frequent basis. So why can't we get a more durable, variant-proof vaccine by
Mhm.
tweaking the nanoparticles, the mRNA, and making it effective against all beta coronaviruses, which is in our reach. We have so many monoclonal antibodies from the treasure chest of people, those rare people that make these potent, broad neutralizing antibodies, which are the template for just these types of vaccines. But we haven't taken them across the goal line in terms of doing clinical trials because we don't have the public-private partnership like we have with Operation Warp Speed. And the companies don't want to take the risk of making it and doing clinical trials without support and de-risking.
Mhm. Do you have any reason for it? It feels like in Washington, for reasons that are quite understandable, they've kind of moved on in terms of investment in COVID. Do you have any reason for optimism that they haven't and that they're going to invest in these kinds of techniques?
Well, there's certainly enough people in the science community that are clamoring that, we're on the brink of success in these areas. Ashish Jha, who we both know very well, is still a major proponent who's pushing hard. He's been up against the wall, but I think it's pretty likely that there'll be some support, but until we see it and how much of it, how much of a priority. My understanding is that there is real interest in moving forward. We could have had these by now. We could have
Right.
had these effects, but it's never too late. And the other point is prepare for the worst case scenario, because if it's something beyond Omicron, whatever that family name or Greek letter is, it's not going to be good. That means the
Mhm.
virus has found yet another path to hurt us and to find hosts and repeat hosts at scale. So we need to prepare for always the worst case scenario. And right now, we've got more capitulation than preparation.
Mhm. You mentioned that the current vaccine, the bivalent, has some efficacy after 6 months, but it clearly has waned a lot in terms of infection and a modest amount or moderate amount in terms of severe infection. Do you think it's waned enough that as we hit the 6 months mark, those of us who got the bivalent in September, we should get another one, or only for much older people, or how do you think about that, or versus a yearly?
Yeah, it's a really important question. A lot of people are asking, I'm sure to you as well. The problem is that we treat everybody the same. And really, if you've had a prior COVID infection, so you have hybrid immunity with the vaccines, your durability protection is much longer. But if you're like me, I've never had COVID.
Nor I. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't plan to get it,
Yeah.
but I don't have that durability.
Mhm.
So, that really good Lancet paper from the University of Washington group last week, I think helped put in perspective that people who get through COVID without problems do have that feature of more durable protection. So, that idea of the bivalent now is started in September. We're getting to the 6 month or more March, 7 month mark. And this is troubling for people who never had COVID, who are of advanced age, and there's no plan until next fall
Yeah.
to do something about it. So, I think it's a problem. There is some vulnerability there that hasn't really been addressed.
So since you're only a few years older than I am, I will not call you of advanced age, but if someone's, and you've already said getting the vaccines, you tend to have some reactions. If someone said, Walgreens calls you this afternoon, says, we got your bivalent, it's ready for you, we're going to go in and take it, or are you going to wait another 6 months?
I'll wait it out because I think the virus is at a low circulating level.
Mhm.
And if I saw a change in that, or if I was going to a place traveling that it was a problem area, then I would probably sign up. But I really don't want to get it when things are relatively quiescent.
So the way you think about it is your risk and your vulnerability has gone up in this as you hit 6, 7 months, But your chances of exposure seem low enough now that as you weigh those two things, you'd rather wait until the chances of exposure, because the prevalence is higher, changes. Not so much that you think your booster is still working super well at 6 or 7 months.
Right. I think the issue is, protection against hospitalizations and deaths remains pretty high. You do get another small jump from the booster to keep it up at that very high 85, 90% level. But we don't have any data for that sixth shot. I mean, in the past, we've had data from Israel and other places. Here, we don't have any. So, it's kind of odd that you'd think, oh, well, after the fifth one, the sixth one works differently. But it would be nice if we had some actual evidence, and we don't right now.
So at this point, you would wait. What if there was a pretty big surge in San Diego? You would get one now?
Yeah, I would take the hit. Yes.
Okay.
Take the shot.
Take the shot. You've done an extraordinary job annotating the literature. Thank you, because we're all dependent on that. Let me just sort of run through a few areas. And I'd love to hear your take on, I think people are following this less carefully than they used to. For a lot of reasons, they may not be on Twitter all the time the way they used to. So let me just give you a few topic areas, and if you could just sort of talk about what you think the literature has taught us in the last couple of months, sort of new studies that have changed the way you think about these topics. So we already started on one, which is the efficacy of the bivalent and how long it lasts, and how effective it is both against COVID, against severe COVID, and also against long COVID. Anything else you'd add in terms of what we learned about this experiment? I think you made the point that when the bivalent rolled out, we didn't have a lot of data on it. It's a big experiment. What have we learned in the last few months about it?
Well, I think the bivalent performed better than was expected. Remember, as you well know, Bob, when it was released in September, we had no human data with that particular shot, a BA.5 booster. But now we have lots of data, and it has everything about it, whether it's the lab for neutralization, whether in fact that we see cross-reactive antibodies to XBB.1.5 and prior to that to BQ.1.1. So it's done a lot to broaden our immunity. And also the clinical data looks really good. So whether you had to have BA.5 or whether just another booster, we can't say that definitively, but it does appear that having that BA.5 spike, which is half of these vaccine boosters that we've had, has broadened the immunity pretty substantially. I don't think we would have seen that with just the Wuhan ancestral spike.
So do you think we stuck with the original booster, there would have been more of a surge in cases with the new variants?
Exactly, because it's so different. If you look at the antigenic distance between Wuhan and Omicron, and compare that from the original Omicron BA.1 to let's say XBB.1.5, this is much more a distance. So I don't think that just having the original booster would have gotten us as far. And I do think it's really helped the protection. And we've seen it how well we did against the XBB.1.5 wave in the United States, where only the Northeast had a bit of a surge, but even that, it isn't entirely clear that it was related to this tough variant. So overall, better than expected, and I give credit here because I questioned it, as you may recall, and I think why don't we wait till we have more data, at least in the lab? But all the lab data, once it was thoroughly reviewed, looked quite encouraging.
And you're attributing some of the lack of a surge with the XBB and the new variants to the bivalent, but not that many people got the bivalent. So maybe take us through, you mentioned the Lancet paper, sort of the new literature on how well infection immunity works.
Right. So first thing about that is, when you want to gauge about hospitalizations and deaths, you look to people 65 and older, and we did get 40% to get the bivalent. It's not great. Remember, as you well know, we had 95% of Americans 65 and older got the original 2 shots.
Mm-hmm.
So 40% isn't great, but remember also that only 15% of the country eligible got the bivalent shot, 16%. So at least we had some better participation among people who needed it the most. So I think that the prior COVID story is one that has been neglected by CDC. And it's really unfortunate. Had we acknowledged, as I tried to plead with the CDC and other means, that prior COVID was worth at least one shot.
Mhm.
If we had done that, we would have decreased the polarization because ultimately that's what the data showed. In fact, maybe even a case of prior COVID, particularly within the last year, could be seen as protective as two shots. But we never gave it, as in many other countries throughout Europe and Asia, where if you had documented prior COVID, that don't have to get the full series. And natural, as it's called, or better, infection-induced immunity uh,
Mhm.
is important because it's to the whole virus, not just to the spike protein.
Mhm.
So it's really disappointing that we made these mandates, you have to get the shots. And, we just we're aggravated already, the anti-vax situation by not acknowledging that this was another way to achieve immunity and that, together. Now, obviously, if you had never gotten a shot, we know that from various sources now that getting at least one vaccine with prior COVID helps to prevent against long COVID.
Mhm.
I think there's several recent studies to suggest that. So there really is a lot more to hybrid immunity than we had originally thought.
Do you think some of that was just the political environment was such that if, that the folks that were sort of hoping to push vaccines for perfectly reasonable, it was the right strategy, felt like if they gave too much credit to infection, they would basically be saying, it's okay to get infected rather than get a vaccine? It's a tricky political dynamic.
It was tricky, but when I talked to senior management at CDC, I said, why don't you do this? It's not that hard. They said, no, it's very hard because we don't know if they really had prior COVID. I said, well, only make it if they have a PCR test that you can review.
Mhm.
And they just said, no, it's too complicated. So it was more about the convenience or lack of convenience, I think. But if you go back, I think that mandate thing really has led to, more of the war or exacerbated the battles that, we just didn't need to raise the heat like that because there was something to it. And then the more data you look, the more clear it became.
And so
Now,
this
the other
this
point,
influences your thinking now that if someone was eligible for the shot, if they'd had an infection, let's say in the last 6 to 12 months, you feel like that's the moral equivalent of the shot. They really don't need another shot.
yeah, I mean, I think that have they had bona fide COVID and they've got a booster at this point.
Right.
And particularly since they got exposed to, as close to the current circulating virus strain as you could imagine.
Mhm.
But the other thing you alluded to, which I think is really important, is we have built in a very sloppy way a relatively strong immunity wall. That is, we didn't get the people vaccinated and boosted as we'd hoped. But overall, the fact that we could stand up so well to these recent variants, better than expected, is a sign that our immunity wall is relatively strong.
Mhm.
It wasn't the best route to get there,
Right.
but I think we can say in retrospect, it will be hard for Omicron family variants unless there's some peculiar recombinants and very unusual mutations that occur outside this spike. It'll be hard for that family to further hurt us based on our current immunity wall.
Mhm. Maybe the most controversial study that's come out in the last month or so is the Cochrane review of masks. Where are you on masks?
Yeah, this is just crazy stuff to me because I just trying to understand how if you wear a mask, particularly one that has really good filtration, how it can help to inhibit a respiratory virus infection. To me, it's like a parachute. I mean, do you have to question that you need a parachute to jump off a plane?
Mhm.
I just don't get this.
Yeah.
And I don't need, some things you don't need randomized trials for. And these are the kind of trials that are virtually impossible to do.
Mhm.
So when you have an analysis that's trying to pull together evidence, that comes out inconclusive based on the kind of evidence that we might apply for devices and drugs and other things, but mass is just not in that category to me. And there's been, I think, some really good recent, Tricia Greenlay from the UK and others have taken apart the Cochrane and also put in perspective why the data is so strong. So to me, this is a no-brainer. And I don't know why this is continued to be questioned.
It fed into the politics. It fed
Yeah.
into, don't make me do something.
Yeah, the mandate. If we just stop the darn mandates, If people just, if you're intelligent, you realize that a high quality mass is going to help to some degree. Now, you could say, what is the magnitude of that? I'm accepting that it's not 100%. Even if you have a tight fit, it's not 100%. But I mean, why do we wear masks in the hospital, Bob?
Yeah.
Help me. It's all, this is just crazy stuff.
Well, they're a lot of them are crummy studies, and a lot of them are studies of mask mandates, which is a different question. Do people wear masks, and do they wear good masks, and do they wear them correctly? It's a different question. But people saw that and say, "Oh, I told you masks don't work," which of course is crazy land.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, you have one of your colleagues there, faculty members of the UCSF, who are leading the charge against all the things that we've been talking about. As
well, we won't go there. What have we learned about long COVID in the last couple of months?
Yeah, not as much as I had hoped we would. So this is a serious issue that is the enduring part of the pandemic, that the inconvenient truth, where we're long on mechanisms, we're short on treatments, i.e. none. We have no definitive treatment for any component of long COVID, of which there are multiple. On the one hand, there's dysautonomia with the postural orthostatic tachycardia. And the other, there's the more pure immune aspects, whether that's manifest through brain fog and many other symptoms. And we haven't made headway. I think there's been some good science to understand and basically back up the mechanisms of a heterogeneous symptom complex. But we've left these people in the lurch. We haven't come up with anything to help treat them. And it's a serious matter because we have around the world tens of millions of people who are suffering. And what's really bad is in the medical community, they're not taking this seriously, or in terms of dismissing it in patients. And also the idea that we haven't gone after it in terms of the randomized trials. Here we do need randomized trials to come up with validated treatments, which are vital.
Yeah. I mean, when we think about long COVID, there's I still have fatigue, or I have brain fog, or I have POTS, or something like that. And then there's mostly Dr. Al-Ali, who we had on several months ago, studies looking at the long-term risk of heart attack, strokes, dementia, kidney disease, diabetes. I mean, I have to say, they're scary as hell. Do you believe them? Do you believe that over in this population, we're going to see increasing rates of chronic, non-infectious chronic diseases across pretty high prevalence in the population because of COVID infections?
That's a great question. Certainly the work, as you mentioned, from Ziad has been very troubling, but it's been reinforced by many other studies. Now we have both Korea and the US with significant increases of heart attack and stroke in the latter follow-up phase, in excess of controls. Another one coming out later this week, the same. So the cardiovascular risk appear to be now replicated independently, multiply. And then the other ones that you've mentioned, whether it's neurologic, kidney, basically all the systems, reproductive, they're of concerns as well. So I think we have to acknowledge that this is an area that only time will tell. Careful studies are obviously vital, but there's a lot of concerns about multi-system involvement appearing late. And as you know, Bob, um, Parkinson's disease as a risk from the original 1918 pandemic didn't crop up for many years.
Mhm.
And post-polio syndrome didn't show itself for at least 10 or 15 years and even occurs in people decades later.
Yeah.
So there are things we still might not know, even though, the things that the science we have seen with respect to, cognition, with respect to, diabetes, type 2 especially, cardiovascular, they're all points of concern.
Yeah. Yeah, when people ask me, how concerned, aren't you concerned about the long-term effects of the vaccine? I say I'm 100 times more concerned about the long-term effects of COVID that we don't fully appreciate yet. In terms of the literature on long COVID, are you convinced that vaccination helps? Are you convinced that Paxlovid helps?
I think there's evidence for both. Another really good study in this week's British Medical Journal got to the vaccine protection. If you look at all the studies, there's ample evidence now that there's some help, whether it's to lessen the severity of symptoms, the duration of symptoms, or prevent long COVID. So I think the only question is it 20-some% or 40%? But there's some reduction. And the same is for Paxlovid. There's about a 25 or so percent reduction of incidence of long COVID, which I think is one of the main reasons to take Paxlovid early, to inactivate the virus, to stop its replication, that is. So yeah, it looks good. And that's why I'm very surprised there hasn't been a Paxlovid randomized trial at scale in people who there's suspicion that they have persistent virus. But yeah, both of those look like they're helping to prevent long COVID. It's the treatment side that we've got problems with because vaccines don't seem to help. Getting a vaccine after you had long COVID, there's not much data to show that it helps. And there's no real treatment yet that's been identified as clearly being beneficial.
Yeah. So when you say you're surprised there hasn't been a randomized trial in treating long COVID, not preventing it, but
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because there's a lot of evidence in some people of persistent virus, whether it's remnants or the virus, the reservoirs of virus. And you'd think there's a chance that Paxlovid could kick in and do something, or another potent oral antiviral pill.
A few more questions on COVID, then I want to toggle to technology. You have done an immense amount of good in combating misinformation, or at least putting out good information. What are your take-home messages after 3 years about the information ecosystem and how well or poorly it's working and how we're going to deal with this problem going forward?
Yeah, this is a biggie. So for almost every day for 3 years, I've put out some information regarding the pandemic. I never thought I'd get into this situation. It's not my field.
Yep.
But I thought, I try to help. But it's gotten pretty hard to continue because the main platform of Twitter has really deteriorated. The reach isn't there, whether it's shadow banning or whether it's just because there's so few employees at Twitter, or I don't know what's going on, but it's profoundly reduced, and the toxicity has gone to new levels like I've never seen, and we've seen a lot in the 3 years. So the idea that you could migrate to Mastodon or Post, those don't have legs, so the reach isn't there, even though the people are much more cordial overall.
Yeah.
And so we have a problem. We've lost our main platform, and I'm quickly losing my motivation to try to help on that matter. And I do like to communicate stuff that I read that I think is interesting, or weigh in. And I've enjoyed the Substack. The problem is I can't even open up for comments because the toxicity migrates over from into that. So I did that in the beginning, and that was over within hours because the mob came on board, and they are organized. I mean. They set each other off. It's highly orchestrated. And it's a sad state that we're in because we never combated misinformation, disinformation from the get-go. And it just has grown. It's funded in a lot of different ways. and we haven't anteed up, and it's just it's a dreadful situation right now. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you won't stop because I think you do a lot of good, and I try to do the same, and it feels like if we give up, it's you're letting them win. I ignore the comments. I just assume it's just the cost of having a platform that they can then hijack, and do what I can. And enough people tell me it's valuable, and I hope they tell you too, because what you do is extraordinarily valuable. But it's hard to figure out how you get around it because everybody's choosing their own information ecosystem, and there's clearly a motivation for misinformation that some of it's financial, some of it I don't understand why you would want people to to encourage people not to do something that can help save their lives. I don't get it, but there you are. But I think the biggest risk is that someone like you who's put the energy into educating people will say this is just not worth it anymore.
Yeah, I'm getting close.
Yeah.
I'm not sure yet.
I'll try to buck you up for another month or so. maybe we can help each other.
Well, you've done a phenomenal job too, and you've reduced your participation of late, haven't you?
A little bit, but I not so much because it's toxic. More, I just don't. I don't want to do it just to do it. I feel like when there's and you, I don't do what you do, which is really annotate the literature. I do. Here's how it's changing how I'm thinking. And it just doesn't change as quickly as it used to. It's pretty stable now for the reasons you articulated.
Right.
Yeah.
I just would say before the pandemic, it was a really great platform to share science and medical stuff. And it was, the net benefit was, palpable. And now, I mean, even if you put stuff that's not related to COVID, there's the people, the response is just, it's ad hominem. It's and I don't look at the comments either. It's just that then people who I do know send me the comments.
Right.
It's like
I hope you're doing okay. Right.
Yeah. It's like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I learned it early on. My younger son had COVID, and I tweeted his case and with his permission. And at one point, when we were debating like how long you should stay in isolation, it was day 7. The CDC said he's okay, you can stop isolation, but his rapid test was floridly positive. And I said, I love him to pieces, but I wouldn't want him to hug me. And people went, what a crummy parent you are that you wouldn't want to hug your child. First of all, he's 28 years old. Second of all, he has a potentially fatal disease. It's like, really? That's where this is? So it is a little wild. Well, one or two more questions about COVID. I want to move on. One of our listeners asked, immunocompromised people, would you recommend a 6th booster now?
Yes, I think, if they can handle it, that I know people who've done that, and you can get it through the drugstores, check immunocompromised. So yeah, I think that would be prudent.
Okay.
I mean,
and just
of course,
maybe,
it's not just mildly incompromised. I mean, that spectrum, more immunocompromised, the more it's important to get it.
And is that because Evusheld doesn't work? If Evusheld still worked, would you think differently about that?
Yeah, no, I think if we had Evusheld, that would be a winner. But it's lost its efficacy. We have nothing else to offer. So yeah, I think that's the main reason.
Okay. And you've told us you haven't had COVID and the prevalence is pretty low in San Diego and all that. So walk us through how you live your life in terms of masking, in terms of indoor dining, what you do on airplanes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I will use a mask, a KN95 on planes and in airports. I have gotten back to traveling to some extent. So yeah. And I don't go often to indoor restaurants, but have more in recent months, weeks at least. But very careful about the setting, and I prefer outdoor and shoot for that, except when it isn't possible. So I try to lean. If I go to the grocery store, which I do not infrequently, I'll wear a mask. So just where the kind of settings where you just don't know. I wouldn't want to be in a crowd, concerts and things that, ball games at the moment, indoors, just because, there was a recent CDC study that showed where they got the planes. They looked at
the wastewater on the planes. Yeah.
From the plane, 80% had people on the plane that had COVID, active COVID. So, it's out there. It's still circulating. The lower it gets, the better. But especially at this point, when I know I'm less protection because of being 6 months out from a booster, I just try to be a little more on the cautious side.
But you will eat in an indoor restaurant on occasions if that feels like the right thing to do. I assume you prefer outdoor if the weather's good and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've said for months, the asymptomatic test positivity rate at UCSF, which we're not testing everybody anymore, but still testing a pretty good portion, is still 2 to 3%. So if you do the math in a plane with 100 people, it's almost 100 guaranteed that there's someone on the plane who has it and feels fine.
Yeah,
So the wastewater doesn't surprise me at all.
exactly.
We have a couple of the Q&A say, Eric, please don't stop on Twitter, exclamation point. And so just, you should know you have a ton of fans out there and it's hard not to pay attention to all the other stuff that comes in, but there's, I think, a silent majority that hopes you'll keep doing it. So I hope you do. Let's switch over to digital. So I assume you've had a chance to play with ChatGPT and the new AI when you first did it. And you've written about AI and the future of healthcare and precision medicine and all that. So when you first used it, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, this is to me very exciting and daunting as well. Of course, it's hard to get one without the other, but it's my main area of research interest, and I'm all over it. That is the whole idea of getting self-supervised, basically unsupervised learning, and that's what ChatGPT brought us, with multimodal, going from text to image to speech, across the different domains, and at GPUs on super steroid doses, as what we had in the deep learning phase. Mm-hmm. So it's in playing with it, you get an impression about its potency and how it has what we've been missing in medicine. We had all these ideas about synthetic notes and keyboard liberation and not having to deal with pre-authorization, automated op notes, automated bedside, round notes. And we can do all that now. I mean, that's what's amazing. We can do all that stuff. We just need to get a ChatGPT or large language model, generative AI, foundation model, whatever term you like. We just have to get that to be pre-trained medically. Right now, what we're working with, if you get on to Bing, which is a little bit more sophisticated than ChatGPT, and it'll be even more so with ChatGPT 4 that's coming soon. You see the power, but it's not medically framed. Once it is, it's going to be a big, I think, net positive shakeup. But it still requires humans in the loop. You still have to, review things. But it's really exciting. And by the way, I do want to compliment you on your team on that grand rounds a week or two ago on this topic.
Okay, thank you.
With Aaron and Sarah and
Atul and Dan Lowenstein. Yeah.
And phenomenal grand rounds that if anybody's interested in the topic, it's worth spending that hour to listen. It was excellent, really well done.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an incredibly fascinating and rich topic. Let me just sort of, having just listened to a New York Times story on Elon Musk and self-driving cars, you say it's still important to have humans in the loop to check and be sure. Do you think that'll happen, or you think as this AI gets better, we all kind of collectively fall asleep at the wheel?
Well, the level 5 self-driving car will never happen. So, Elon Musk, who is not a man of great integrity or character, who keeps saying it will, is wrong, because that means it has to work in all conditions, and it can. And so he's been hyping that up, and that's part of the problem with AI. It's had hype for decades. And that's why at one point it went to a very serious winter. At this point, it's the issues are, we have to balance its expectations. You can't just have all these things that are mentioned about keyboard liberation, where you see a patient in clinic, and not just the notes generated, but the future appointments, the labs or whatever tests that are being ordered, prescriptions are done. You can't do that without surveillance, without editing and, getting it all validated. But And then the other thing is UCSF or different institutions going to roll on their own, or are we going to have some that are, generally applicable on a wide scale basis?
Right.
These are some imminent questions, but there isn't any question in my mind now that we have solved the missing link of how to go from the data to generating, the components, the pieces that we need in medicine. Because right now, if you were to say what would be the immediate thing that could fix a lot of the despair of clinicians, the data clerk functions that are so burdensome and detract from care of patients, it would be this. And I think it's imminent, more imminent than ever before, that we'll start to see it. But the human in the loop, just because it generates all those things, you can't not look at it.
Right. But I guess that sounds right, and yet that's what I tell people periodically is like, I don't remember my wife's cell phone number anymore because it's in my phone. And so I've turned that part of my brain off. If I ever lose my phone, I may never see her again because, you just your brain gets lazy. And so in some ways, it's like the self-driving car. You wonder whether it reaches a point that it's so good that, yes, the human should be in the loop, but the human's hard to pay attention when it's right 98% of the time. So it's tricky to get that balance right.
Yeah, and there's other motivations too. This started with the heuristic models of ECG interpretation.
Right.
And then, you're getting reimbursed by overreading the ECGs and you're busy and you just sign off on them. And it isn't just because you can't read the ECG, but you have other reasons to not have the oversight you should. No, there are concerns there that, atrophy of surveillance or lack of incentives or whatever. So yeah, that's all part of the human in the loop, the real human, the intent human in the loop, right?
And you've written, of course, about how at least the hope and theory is that it frees us up from these mundane, data clerk kinds of tasks and opens up time for humanism. That's a perfectly reasonable point of view. And the other reasonable point of view is that time will just get filled in with more tasks. Do you think you're confident that the time will be protected and will be used on the things that humans are uniquely good at doing?
Right. So the theme of gift of time, which is what this can bring us. And it really wasn't realistic until we saw the large language models. But the gift of time isn't just on the clinician side, remember, it's also on the patient side. They're going to be capturing their data and having it algorithmically interpreted. And most of the common diagnoses will at least be screened, before doctorless, before consulting with a clinician. So there's a lot of drivers to get us the gift of time and get us into caring mode, which is, what Aaron Neinstein elaborated so nicely. I think the issue that you're bringing up is the overlords. So we have these overlords. I can't speak now to the current ones at UCSF, but throughout this country, we have administrators who are, financially driven for revenue, and they have no motivation to say you have more time with patients. In fact, their motivation is read more scans, see more patients, read more slides, and on and on. Right. So the only way we can buck that is to have the gravitas of the medical community standing up for patients and our profession. And we haven't seen that. We have no organization that is ready for that. And that's basically what I wrote about in the New Yorker. We really need to unite and not let what you're describing happen, because by default, that is, the financially big business of medicine and healthcare. That's what would happen.
Yeah. So Nora Goldschlager says, quote, I have unique Topol stories, but we're not going to give her a chance to talk about them. But then she says, but seriously, please tell me how I will not be put out of business with AI. So what do you tell a young doctor as they look at these models and just say, am I going to have a job? I just spent $200,000 on my education and all of that. And, I'd love to have a career like Eric had, but 30 years from now, what's going to be the job of a doctor?
Well, I wish I could go back, because the AI world will ultimately get us to be far more accurate in making diagnoses. It'll give more autonomy to patients, those who want it.
Mhm.
and we'll then be spending the time uh, that's needed for serious matters. And I think, and getting back to the initial mission of why we went into medicine, which was caring for patients, that they know we have presence, they can trust, they have that patient-doctor relationship, that bond, the humanity of medicine, that it can be restored. I think it's the most exciting time ever in medicine going forward, as we, get over these gaps from theory to practice. But no, this is not about replacing anyone. It's about what medicine, the essentiality of medicine, which
Mhm.
is the human connect, and letting a lot of the other stuff get done or facilitated, improved. I mean, you know how long it takes to review a complex chart of a patient. Imagine that's all done for you
Yeah,
accurately
yeah,
before you even, start to look at the thing. So time is what is the AI gift to us so that we can get back to real medicine, I think.
yeah. I hope so. If we get it right, that would be terrific. Do you think the earliest use cases are in some ways sort of taking the encounter and just, all right, I don't have to document it, or yeah, I needed to write a letter to the insurance company to get permission for the MRI. It kind of knows that that's what I do, and it does it in my style. Or do you think it's more at the level of it's helping me make the diagnosis? It's looking at what's going on and saying, patients like this turned out to have lupus, and make sure you send these tests. Is it sort of on the operational kind of get stuff done boring part, or is it on the more essential doctoring part that where you think is going to have the biggest impact?
Well, I think both will be major fronts, but the one about operational may be the one that is of more critical need because doctors don't perceive their diagnosis issues right now very well, even
Mm-hmm.
though we know there's more than 20 million a year of serious diagnostic errors. So they don't perceive it because it's, unusual for them, but they do perceive the operational issues
Well,
and
it's
all.
either unusual or they never find out that they got it wrong.
Right, exactly. So, but cumulatively, once we get over the operational and concurrently, we'll address the accuracy. And I think that's going to be really another big step. But,
Yeah.
they're not mutually exclusive, but what's the crisis right now? I think we can address that pretty effectively.
Yeah. You've written a lot about the democratization of care. And in some ways, one of the things that technology always does is democratize stuff. It just sort of means you don't have to go see your accountant or the travel agent or the banker. This, the technology helps you do that. How do you see the balance of that? From having read you, I know you think it's net good. Do you have any worries about that patients will have, in some ways, false reassurance that they have made their own diagnosis or they're managing their own care, and it's sometimes maybe they should be seeing a doctor? How do we get that balance right?
Well, I think we know what we have right now, which is, Google and other websites, and that doesn't work very well because basically people look things up, and whatever they read about, they have that disease. There's no specificity about their actual objective data.
Hmm.
So here, we have advanced searches, which is going to be happening in healthcare, where that person's data specifically is used to help, give a differential of what is happening. So
Hmm.
I think that it's going to go to a better level. It doesn't mean we're not going to have cyberchondriacs or we're not going to have, people misled, but it can't get much worse than it
Yeah.
is now. So
Yeah.
I'm actually, thinking this is the reboot of search, which is all part of this kind of revolution, will, rather than trying to look at all the different hits on multiple pages, where it's really laid out in the way you want it to be, is really going to be a plus, I think.
Yeah. Do you think it'll make healthcare less expensive? Some ways we always talk about quality and patient experience and democratization, and these days we talk some about equity, which is great. But ultimately, in some ways, the biggest crisis is that it's 20% of our GDP and bankrupting governments and businesses and individual people. So do you think is that part of what you think is likely to happen?
Well, that's the trend if we don't again try to arrest it or sidestep it. So, the biggest potential, which is going to happen, and I wrote a Substack on it, Hospital at Home.
Mhm.
So of the $4 trillion we spend a year, the biggest chunk is hospitals. And of course, we have perverse incentives in this country because the American Hospital Association is one of the largest lobbying groups. And the last thing they want is to have hospital at home. And there is no reimbursement except temporarily because of the pandemic for hospital at home. But now with the AI, with all the different capturing of data, and this is not with clinicians in the home. This is only going to the home if there's algorithmic prediction that there's trouble afoot. So, I think this has got, if we can gut hospitals, except for, the ICUs and emergency rooms and operating rooms, but if we get regular hospital rooms and we keep people in their home, provided they have a home, that we can take out a huge part of our annual costs in healthcare. So that's a further away. I acknowledge that it's not going to happen quickly. But if we were serious about cutting costs, we would get on it. We would do the validation studies, and we would, you might just do it for heart failure or pneumonia or certain things, and then broaden it to all comers.
Maybe getting to the end, as you've been studying the digital transformation of medicine over the last 10 years, what are the lessons that you take away that you think will help inform what the next 10 years are like in terms of, is it harder than it looks or easier than it looks, or obstacles you wouldn't have expected have kind of emerged themselves? How do you see this pretty bumpy path so far?
Well, I'm an old dog, so I know it takes a lot longer than you would ever think it would be fathomable. I mean, when I saw the light of digital medicine, with the iPhone in 2007 and how little we've actually progressed in digital medicine, here we are 16 years later, it's sobering. There's lots of obstacles. We get in the way of ourselves. We are our own worst enemies in medicine of progress. And, instead of trying to get the validation, we just let stuff sit and kind of let the potential get not actualized. So I hope that we can move things forward. I mean, there's a lot of exciting things happening right now, not just in AI, obviously with genome editing of incurable diseases, but we don't know how we're going to pay for it. There's so many things that on life science and medicine that are exciting that hopefully won't take 15, 17 years to actually get into medical practice routinely. So, I mean, to me, the being so impatient, that's the hardest thing, is that we eventually get there, but it takes so darn long and unnecessary lost opportunity.
Do you think we've been talking about precision medicine kind of being around the corner for 20 years or 30 years, and it feels sort of real-ish in certain parts of medicine, like in oncology and maybe a little bit in cardiology. Do you feel like we're at the cusp, is that things have changed enough technologically and or politically, culturally, economically, that it's going to be very real in the next 10 years?
Well, it could be more real today if we had pharmacogenetic tests that could be done cheaply and immediately for over 150 drugs that have a genomic label. But you've touched on, in oncology, there's no question about matching up mutations with drugs, although, it isn't always saving lives and curing cancer. It's making some improvement. I think the genome editing, if that isn't precision medicine, then nothing is, right? And we're already seeing cures of diseases that, were not, there was nothing to offer folks. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not a light switch. It comes slowly. In neonatal ICUs, a baby comes in today, you don't know what the diagnosis, you do genome sequencing, you make the molecular diagnosis, you give a definitive treatment, you prevent the baby's death or end organ damage that's irrevocable. That's precision. So we're going to see it. It's just not what you're making diagnoses, molecular diagnoses of rare unknown diseases. Eventually we'll get there. Eventually the accuracy in medicine, not so much the precision, will be promoted. And we won't be using this stupid term anymore about precision. We'll just, get to a new level of medicine that is
just be medicine.
Yeah.
We won't be talking about digital medicine either. No. It'll just be medicine. Well, when I tell, the House staff periodically, about what it was like, paper charts and going to the VA and down to the lab and going through the shoebox looking for your lab slips. And they, of course, think I'm 10,000 years old, but
Yeah, we do our own gram stains and our own analysis.
stain.
Reel the patient in the mission to get their X-rays. Oh yeah, no, they think it's just crazy stuff. Right?
The days of the giants. Eric, thank you so much. And we at UCSF are incredibly proud of all the things you've done and hope you keep it up in terms of getting the word out and getting truth out. It's really been important and really transformative for those of us following along. So thank you for everything.
Deeply appreciated. Keep up the great stuff at UCSF.
We will do our best. Be well. Thanks.